And that will be Erv Garrison. And he'll be presenting the Archaeology and Geoarcheology of Galveston-Trinity Bay. Erv, are you out there?
I'm here.
Hi.
Hi. If Jillian will let me share screen, I'll...
Yes, please.
My goodness, look at that.
You're live.
Can you see me?
Yes, sir.
Can you see my boat?
Yes.
All right, if everybody's happy, I will proceed.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mary. Well, yes, for those of you in in-person attendance, hello. For those of you who are out there in the cyber world, hello as well. Let me preface my presentation with I'm going to take you west to Texas and to western Louisiana in my presentation. I'm going to get you dirty, and I'm going to get your feet wet, and maybe even a little wetter. This isn't what we would call a high-level theoretical presentation. This is really boots on the ground kind of stuff. This is work that I did over 30 years ago when I was in Texas and on the staff of Texas A&M University in College Station. So, fresh out of graduate school, I landed in College Station and was immediately exposed to an archaeology that I certainly I did not have a lot of experience with. And I wasn't alone in that because if I can get this thing to move, there we go. Turn my timer on. Frank Hull, who is certainly a much better known archaeologist to many of you in the audience and out there. Frank Hull, you almost think of Frank in terms of another archaeologist, Heiser. You always talk about, it's almost like they're joined at the hip. You always, in graduate school in archaeology, particularly in prehistoric North American archaeology, you always read about Hull and Heiser. And Frank came to Rice University about the same time I came to Texas A&M. And he began working in this coastal region about the same time. And he expressed a humility as well as me that we really didn't know much about what we were getting into. The archaeology of the coastal zone of particularly East Texas and western Louisiana was vastly different than anything that we had experienced both in our training and our professional lives. So we had a learning curve to go up, and we did. He did better than I. And I pulled a quote out of one of Frank's early reports on some work that he did in Harris County, which is Houston, to those of you who know the area. The problems require that we adopt a broad regional view of local archaeology and a systematic, I would say compilation, but he said compiling of information from many sites. The questions concerning how Indians adapted to the area require that we learn about the land as it was before the modern era, the natural environment and its changes. And I think that's really one of the themes of this conference, is that we're looking at different regions, but we're trying to get a grasp of this pre-paleo environment, if you will, and understanding the landscapes like Darren just discussed. How do we retrodict our understanding of these areas? And my brief, small example that I'm presenting today shows you one way that we simply do that. We do the work. And so I'm going to take you to Houston. I'm going to take you actually up toward Baytown. I see if I can get my handy dandy annotator here. There we go. So here's Baytown, just a large burb of Greater Houston. But this is the area that you want to focus on. You're coming into Galveston Bay, you're going up the ship channel through the bay, then you eventually go up into this river section, which is created up here, and then you go into Buffalo Bayou, which is the Houston ship channel. So all of these what seemingly look like bay islands are not islands. They're dredge spoil islands that have been created by the Corps of Engineers during dredging. So, and that's one of the reasons that I was charged with investigating the sites that I'm going to present to you now. So let's see if we can make this thing go. All right, it's going. Kill this thing. Now, I am a geoarchaeologist, so I need to say something about relative sea level. And as we know from Woody Gagliano and Charlie Pearson and a host of their colleagues, the Sabine Trinity Paleo River was flooded just after 6,000 BP, probably around 5,300 BP. I stole this straight out of Andy Hemming's presentation yesterday, and I think that is accurate. And throughout the Archaic period, this coastline changed into what we consider, and in what is classified in the rubric of Texas archaeology as the late prehistoric and historic periods of today. I took this out of our colleague Worrell's presentation of 2021, which Jim shared with me, and I want to thank him for that. So this is a panorama that I pieced together from some photographs that I made on this one particular project, and this is called Lost Lake of the old San Jacinto River. And it's not a tourist destination, as you can see. I want you to focus over here on the right with this power line, and then this coastline over here, which is basically, it is a real island, and we'll see that. So this is a typical upper Galveston-Trinity Bay panorama. Just happens to be at Lost Lake on the old San Jacinto. There are hundreds of prehistoric shell middens found along the coastal margins of southeast Texas, and with a few having some historic components. The coastal margin of this region is, now I want to make this very clear, this is a very circumscribed zone. It's about 29 kilometers wide from the present shoreline to where the upper reaches of tidal flow creates brackish water. And this coastal margin had a hunter-gatherer lifeway that emphasized the exploitation of aquatic food resources, but also used terrestrial food resources such as deer and alligator, by the way. The cultural sequence for the coastal margin of Southeast Texas has been discussed in numerous reports, Leland Patterson not being the least of which, and Larry Ayton and others. And this sequence has a known time period from the, I would say not the early Archaic, I would say more like the late Archaic, through the historic Indian period, all the way up into the 19th century. Artifacts assemblages along this coastal margin are shell middens that are different, that have different artifact assemblages from inland southeast Texas. And when I say inland, I'm talking about like 20 miles north of the coast. Things change dramatically once you leave this coastal margin. Coastal margin sites usually have much pottery, not a lot of pottery, and not a lot of lithic materials. Whereas the inland sites tend to have, well, a lot more lithic materials and lesser amounts, I wouldn't say modest, lesser amounts of pottery, and there's certainly no shell tools found inland, unless they've been traded in from the coast. So, moving on. The archaeology of Trinity and Galveston Bay and this area is not understudied in the sense that we know a lot about where there are sites. And if you simply go up here to the Lost Lake disposal area, which I'm going to be talking about, look at the number of sites. 41 Harris 10, 41 Terrace 11, 41 Harris 12. I mean, when I went into this area to examine the cultural resources here, look what I had to contend with. I had to be aware that this area was surrounded by known archaeological sites. And if you go up Buffalo Bayou into the upper Hunting Bayou disposal area, you run into the same thing. There are numerous documented sites up there. So it's not like you're depauperate in something to find, but seeing it on the ground is a different matter. What I'm talking about today comes out of two reports that were published in the early 80s. One of them here is this is the actual report for this particular disposal area, and the other is a report that a little bit more elaborate project that we did over just east of Sabine Lake. So again, it's in this coastal zone. It is an example of this archaeology that I want to share with you. So let's zoom in on Lost Lake. This is a real island. It has been augmented significantly by dredging activities to keep the ship channel deep enough for ships like this. That's about a 700 or 800 foot container ship going into the Houston ship channel and up into the area, that highly developed area just outside of Houston, just outside of the 610 Beltway. So this is the old river circling around, coming into Buffalo Bayou. For you historic buffs, that's the battleship Texas over there. So again, we've got all these sites located in this area. So let's zoom in. This is Lost Lake. This is the particular project area that I'm speaking about right now. So let's zoom in here. And you can see back on this island, so to speak, that is an artificial levee created by the Corps of Engineers and for dredge disposal. So a lot, as I say, when this island has been augmented, it has been augmented significantly by sediments taking out of the ship channel and up here. And one reason that we were asked to survey this particular area was they were establishing what's called a barge fleeting facility. Basically, it's a barge parking lot for barges that are used on the San Jacinto and in the bay, and so it's an industrial site. So it was threatened by industrial development. Hence, call the archaeologists. Okay, so here we are again, back on this panorama, and we simply did what all CRM firms do today. We did a shoreline walkover survey because I have a expertise in geoprospection. We decided that we would use magnetometer and fathometer to at least locate historical metal objects and things that might be in the survey area, because they charged us to look for historic materials as well as prehistoric. So we did 60-meter offsets, and then if we found anything, and either prehistoric or historic, in the water, we simply either put on our mask, and some places where the water was over a meter deep, we'd actually put on a tank and do some underwater survey. I like to say that I'm probably one of the first archaeologists to ever do underwater archaeology in the Houston Ship Channel, and it's not something I would recommend Jim Dunbar knows that commercial divers are probably in there every week, but it's certainly not a diving destination. And then we did, as all projects do, we did shovel tests of all the shoreline and inundated sites. So now I'm going to report to you our findings, and there they are. The upper left is a shell midden. It's a rangia midden. These are clams. And this is typical for what you see when you excavate one of these sites. What I put a contrast in there. This is probably at low tide. This is at high tide. So you're working in a tidal range, typical Gulf, not much of a tidal range, but the site can go from a low wetland shoal into inundated very quickly. And this particular site that we were showing the test on, 41 HR 11, does turn into a shoal at high tide. So what did we find? These are very thin sites. There's no deep stratigraphy as a rule. We don't see paleo as a rule. It is not something that's really commonly found in this area. In western Harris County, yes. North, as you go inland, yes, you may actually encounter these earlier, like early archaic, late paleo sites, but they are not common. They're almost invisible in the coastal zone. So we tend to divide the world up into ceramic and pre-ceramic. And I'll show you how we do that. We based it on the presence or absence of pottery. And pottery first appears in the upper Texas coast around 200 BC, but certainly by AD, we're dealing with a variant of what is known in Louisiana as chifuncte. And chifuncte pottery is basically an untempered pottery, first described, well, not just first described, but certainly well described by Larry Ayton. In eastern Texas, the locals developed a very common pottery type called Goose Creek. And there's a variant that we find in our project area called San Jacinto. To me, it's a Goose Creek pottery, and you can see here a couple of reconstructions that you can do based upon what you find. And you have these round bottom, very thick walled kinds of vessels, and they're not uncommon. They're not uncommon. You find a lot of this stuff. So in the little site that I illustrate here, 41 HR 11, which again is basically a shoal, we found 13 pieces of San Jacinto plain and 3 pieces of Goose Creek plain, and 1 San Jacinto incised. We found some bone fragments and Firecock rock, and the shell midden terminated at 25 centimeters in all of our units. So it's very thin type of site. So we don't have any real dates for the Lost Lake sites, only that we know that the upper horizons are ceramic bearing and very likely are all after AD 100. But if you're looking at the deposits before the ceramic period, you're looking at a late archaic coastal zone with very sluggish streams that are becoming more brackish and tidal as sea level advances into what had been riverine environments, and now they are becoming either bayhead deltas and then eventually into bays. So, like I've said, the one little example I present here is a shoal at high tide, and today it probably doesn't exist at all. It'll be just like Sharp's Island in the Chesapeake. It has been eroded and simply doesn't exist anymore. So, a little summary of this very humble example from the Galveston-Trinity Bay. Hull again says it's apparent that the basic lifeways of these Indians did not change much in late prehistory and in history, and it's true. We cannot pretend that sites that we've studied in Lost Lake are comprehensive, nor would Frank Hole say that his work is. But we can say that people like Larry Ayton and Leland Patterson are extremely knowledgeable and have developed a rich and comprehensive prehistory, survey of this prehistory. On our limited results, we can say that the sites were occupied on probably a seasonal round and not on an annual basis. The Midden itself doesn't give us any clues as to duration. But an analysis of the faunal materials like deer and shellfish help us pin down when it was probably maximally occupied. Now, Lost Lake in this archaeology of the Trinity and Galveston Bay folds into a larger context, and that includes the Sabine, the Calcasieu, and the Mermentau onto the southwest Cheniere Plain, and I'd like to take you there briefly to summarize this. So this is the Sabine River, this is Sabine Lake, and this area has been extensively reported on by Gagliano and others, so I'm not going to repeat that. I can tell you, though, that the archaeology over in the Galveston-Trinity Bay, it mimics a lot of the archaeology in the Sabine Lake, and as you move into the Cheniere Plain of southwestern Louisiana. So we're going to look briefly here at sites in this area, so let's do that. It looks a lot like, if you take away the refineries and the subdivisions, this looks a whole lot like what Harris County probably looked like before it was developed. And the archaeological sequence, ceramic sequence, is a lot longer in this area, but the coastal adaptation is almost a mirror image of what we see in Texas. And this site, I'm going to use this as my one example. This is 16 Cameron 47, and it's a shell midden. But unlike Lost Lake, look at the depth of this. It almost approaches a mound in thickness, and you can see the range pole in the background, and you can see it's a quite thick midden that runs all the way into the water. You can see again, though, erosion is real. A lot of this is created by vessel traffic, but again, it is natural as well. So we're losing these sites just as well as we're losing the little sites like along the Buffalo Bayou. The material culture is about the same. The faunal materials are almost the same. I show you something that does differ a little bit from East Texas. The lower Mississippi Valley ceramic assemblage and complexes do not penetrate eastern Texas. It's almost like there's a demilitarized zone north of Houston. Caddoan and Caddoan-like pottery does not penetrate into this coastal zone. You have this local indigenous Goose Creek, San Jacinto plain. But if you move into southwestern Louisiana and the Sabine Lake, you do see later ceramic types moving in. Coles Creek, Plaquemine, certainly. So there is that difference. But the lifeway, the resource extraction is the same. Good dark point recovery. This came out of the sites that I'm indicating here. You've got on the left, you've got a really reworked Gary Point. Then you've got in the middle, you've got one that's in pretty good shape. And then over on the right, you've got another dark point, which is classified as an Ellis in the typologies of this area. Again, you don't have to look hard to find archaeological sites. They're everywhere. But in this complex just here in Calcasieu River, you can see you have 1, 2, 3, and there are 4, five. I'm almost missed the one on Choptique. These are, again, shell middens. They're densely occupied. You can't dig a hole without coming up with an extensive amount of pottery, and when you leave the pottery zone, you still continue to find a rich assemblage of faunal materials, because the preservation in these sites is really incredible. But this aerial photograph was taken in the late 80s. Do I think those sites are there today? Probably not. So, let's sum up. This is only a snapshot. This just shows you in a sort of boots on the ground way what these river and estuarine sites look like in the upper Texas coast and eastward to southwest Louisiana. The examples I've shown are not uncharacteristic. Like Darren said when he was talking about the Chesapeake finds, this is what you expect. This is not unusual. So we have these pottery-bearing shell deposits on all the land surfaces. So it's a dead giveaway. Okay, there's a site there. Is the site going to be deeply stratified into the Archaic? Maybe, if you're lucky. But again, it is a very circumscribed zone, and the archaeology is very unique. So the cultural model, if you're going to build one, it's a marine resource economy of coastal populations that from the Archaic on were ecotonally circumscribed into the historic period. And my great cultural hero, the shipwrecked conquistador Cabeza de Vaca, wrote extensively about his experiences with the historic cultures in this area. And we can almost upstream from de Vaca's account into trying to describe this prehistoric foraging and fishing culture, which simply added pottery to a well-established basket technology. And it was successful. Again, you go back to the old lay of, if it works, why change it? And I think in this particular example, material, this is a very internally consistent and recognizable form of prehistoric adaptation that runs for hundreds of kilometers east and west of the Galveston-Trinity. There are thousands of these sites, but I'm afraid due to sea level rise, coastal erosion and development, many are gone today. So I appreciate your attention, and this is the last speaker on the last day signing off.
Erv, don't go anywhere yet. We may have some questions for you. Are there questions from anybody here in the audience? Jim?
Why would you do this?
Yeah. Hey, Erv. It's Jim Dunbar here. The reason we had the archaeology part of it scheduled for yesterday, but Darren Lowry, his job got in his way and he couldn't make it, except for the weekend. So we shifted this section to today, and I appreciate that. I need to say something about Erv. He's a recent past chair of the Department of Anthropology at UGA, as well as holds a position at the Department of Geology. And he and I were the divers that found the important part of Rayhole Springs and got it dated. Live oak at 8,200 years, brackish water oyster at 7,400 years. And that site has artifacts. It's 22 miles offshore in Appalachia Bay. And I'm going to shut up now, but very much appreciate you being here today.
Well, I got to hear Darren's talk, and I always enjoy, I've enjoyed listening to everyone else. Of course, my day job kind of got in the way yesterday, so I had to cherry pick the presentations, but I got to see a lot more than I thought I would, so I've enjoyed joining y'all virtually.
Erv, hold on one second. We have another question.
Wondering if anyone's researched is there any archaeological remains from the hurricane of, was it 1901? Galveston?
1906.
Six, okay.
It's called Isaac Storm,
Right, I
in
read the
honor
book.
of the meteorologist that said you better run, and they didn't. Unfortunately, it's 6,000 people died at least, as far as we know, on Galveston Island. Has there been archaeology? Not as much as there should be.
That's a great book, by the way, if you haven't read it.
Isaac Storm, oh yes, that's a classic, and it lays out the whole history of weather forecasting as it existed then. But again, after that storm, Galveston sort of reinvented itself, both geomorphologically, it raised itself 20 feet, and in clearing out the debris, they erased a lot of what we would consider to be historic evidence of that. But again, there's not been enough done.
Anyone else in the room? Jill, any online? Well, Erv, we may be last, but I think they saved the best for the last, the archaeology.
I'm good with that.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.